Jude Bellingham came to that training ground a few years ago when they were trying to sign him. And from what I can gather, he and his dad weren't all that impressed by what they saw.
So Erik Ten Hag stays and talks have begun for a new deal. What a turnaround, eh? We're touching on the fallout of that alongside a Carrington facelift and a touching story from a lifelong Red with a remarkable connection to this football club. It's all coming up on episode 7 of The Theatre of Red. Hello there, one and all, wherever you are tuning in today. We do thank you. We hope all is well in your part of the world. Now, following a very positive week of feel-good news for once from Manchester United, supporters are now revelling in the news that Erik Ten Hag will remain as manager. And not only that, but the prospect of a £50 million project to bring facilities at Carrington back into the modern day. I'm delighted to celebrate this news alongside a top bloke, the author of the truly beautiful United with Dad and a lifelong Red, Mr. Simon Lloyd. How are you today, sir?
I'm good. Thanks very much for having me along.
You're very welcome. Simon, there's nowhere else to start than on the managerial topic at the club. Now, for the majority, that came as a welcome piece of information that the hierarchy have opted to stick to a project, commit to the man. How did you yourself feel when confirmation landed last week that he was going to be staying at the club?
I think I'm pleased on the whole. I think, I wasn't too sure after the cup final. I thought my feeling after the cup final, to be honest, was that he's got to stay now. But then you kind of leave it a couple of days and you wait to see if that was just the emotion of that day taking over and whether that was influencing it a little bit. But I think mainly because looking at the other options that were being mentioned, your likes of Thomas Tuchel and what you will, I didn't really look at anyone there and think they were anything more than a sideways step. So for me, I think it is the right decision. And a lot of people are giving Ineos a bit of grief, I think, as well, because of the amount of time it had taken. And I think you've got to look at it from their point of view too, because they're obviously relatively new to the club. They had to look at it with a bit of a cold perspective and not really be too emotional about it. And the fact of the matter was United finished 8th last year. So as far as I can see it was the right thing to do to at least consider whether it was right to stick with Ten Hag. And it might have taken a while and it might have been a bit frustrating for the likes of us lot who were in the dark a bit with it. But I think ultimately it's probably the right decision. It's not to say he got everything right last year, because clearly there were times where the football was terrible and some of his decision making was perhaps questionable. But I think, I've had loads of mates who argue this with me, but I think the injuries were bad and people will immediately counter that with saying, well, other teams had injuries too. I don't think people can fully appreciate how bad United's injuries were, though. I think that the number of them and the duration of some of them as well, I think that any other team in that situation, and I don't think any other team in the Premier League did have that level of injuries, I think would have been hit hard. That's not to say he couldn't have done better at times, but I think it's a massive mitigating factor in what happened. So, yeah, I think it is right to stick with him for now. This isn't to say if they have a bad start to the season, we're back at, the rumours about various other managers coming back in again. But I think for now, it's the right call. It's a sensible one.
Obviously, there was so much speculation about what was going to happen, and
Yeah.
a very, very long, sort of prolonged period where everybody was in the dark. There was a lot of unknowns. Now, like you, I very much, I applaud that. I like the fact that there was little to no information really being leaked until they wanted it to be leaked. One thing about this that maybe people will question, on one hand, you're now looking at negotiations for a contract renewal for the manager. And you have in the stance that there was uncertainty as to whether he was staying. And also his current deal has an option for an additional 12 months if needs be. If there was such uncertainty and there was such a requirement to interview these managers, from Tuchel to Southgate to De Zerbi to Thomas Frank, whoever it was, do you think that they have maybe jumped the gun in entering into renegotiations to extend the contract before we see how the squad responds to this at the start of next year? Or do you think it was the correct move as a sign of support and backing for their manager?
I think to be honest, if you've gone through that process now and you've decided you've got to stay with him for now at least, I think it's probably the only option they've got. I think they have to give him some kind of backing now. And the most logical way of doing that would be to extend his contract. Um, I mean, I saw him on Dutch TV speaking during, I think it was the England game, wasn't it? And he was kind of hinted that nothing is set in stone with that, and I quite understand him having that. He's kind of got to like fight his own corner a little bit there, hasn't he? But I do think it's the only option. I think that United have got to offer some kind of contract extension now. It doesn't have to be a particularly long one, but as a show of faith to him now, they've got to give something back, I think. So I wasn't massively surprised that that was the next course of action.
Before I go any further, it is worthwhile noting to anyone listening here that we're recording this before Thursday night's fixture between England and Denmark. Ten Hag obviously offered his punitary duties during England's Euro opener against Serbia, as you just alluded to, a 1-0 victory for Southgate's side. He was in positive mood, and he supplied a variety of information about the likes of Southgate, and in his typical Dutch manner, addressed every single question in that just monotone that he has.
Yeah.
But he also ultimately stated that the club concluded that they already had the best manager installed, and I like that. Based on what you saw in England's display on Sunday, Southgate certainly didn't do anything to contradict Ten Hag's statement about the best manager being there, did he?
No, I think it's, I'm an Englishman, obviously. I want to see England do well. I'm not. I've never been as passionate about England as I have about United. It's just always been the way. But watching that game, to me, it was pretty familiar. Now I think Southgate does tend to set most of his England teams up quite well from kickoff. I know there'll be people questioning why he put Alexander-Arnold in instead of Mainu or whoever else in midfield, and I get that. But I think typically they do tend to start relatively well. You look at like the big games and stuff that they've been involved in, even like the France game at the last World Cup, even the Croatia game in the semi-final of the World Cup, they do tend to start well. His big issue, though, seems to be he doesn't seem to have the ability to change things in a game to stop the tide turning. And I think we saw that against Serbia too. I think, again, started quite well, got an early goal, and you kind of expected him to build on that. Maybe not go out and put 5 goals past them, but at least make it a little bit more comfortable than it was. But again, you can just sense the game after half an hour, it starts to turn, and it seems to be a bit of a recurring theme, this, with a lot of Southgate's games in major tournaments. Now, I know a lot of people will say that, you've got to be a bit more pragmatic in these tournaments, and I definitely think there's an element to that. But I do think that the pragmatism does tend to cost him a little bit, especially with the players at his disposal now. And this to me would be why him stepping back into club management, particularly with United, because again, he's been heavily linked, hasn't he? I don't think would be a particularly good idea. I've seen a lot of links, obviously, with him to United, and I do kind of understand it to a degree, because I think that if you look at what he's done for the culture of the England team, I do think that side of it within a club like United, where things have been quite fractious for a while with the playing staff, if all the reports are to be believed, I do think that would be quite appealing. But I don't think he can transfer a lot of what he's done in international football to club football, especially not at a club with United scrutiny that comes his way, that would come his way.
I think of all the names that were being linked, he was the one that sort of categorically met a resounding no from the fan base. And
Yeah,
even after that game with Serbia, Ten Hag was asked how he felt about the tactical setup, how he felt about the way they played. He reserved, obviously, special praise for Jude Bellingham, and basically said that he carried the team on his back in the first half. And then he alluded to how Southgate sort of almost like, as you said, retracts into himself, and it's like tries to consolidate victory.
it's a bit like Mourinho light, but you don't have the security that Mourinho used to bring when he was at the peak of his powers. Like when Mourinho had his Chelsea side and the Inter Milan side, you knew that and even to a degree his Porto side, you knew that once they were ahead and he decided to lock it down, they were going to give you virtually nothing. You feel with this England team that they will always give you at least a couple of chances, or they've got that ability to do something silly. Defensively now as well, I don't think this is a particularly strong one. I think that if you look at generations gone by where you had, Rio Ferdinand, John Terry, Leather King, Sol Campbell, players like that, you don't really have any outstanding centre-halves now like you did. And I think to play in a tournament and to try and make it secure like that, you kind of need that kind of figurehead at the back now, which England don't really have anymore.
As much as I agree with everything that you've said about Southgate, about Ten Hag, and as much of a supporter as I am of Ten Hag, I did find that little part ironic when he not necessarily chose to
Mm.
criticise Southgate, But he pointed out the tactical flaws there. We saw that quite a lot with Manchester United last year as well, where there was games where they were playing quite well, took a lead, and then fell back in themselves to consolidate, and ultimately brought more pressure upon them. So I thought
Yeah,
that it was very similar to what we saw throughout the entire season. But when you factor in the work that Ten Hag has completed, and you're looking at 3 finals, 2 cups to his name, I believe that ultimately it was the correct decision for him to stay, particularly when you factor in the variables that he was dealt with, like you spoke about with the injuries. In moving forward, and assuming that he welcomes back all of his star names from injury, Lissandro Martinez, Luke Shaw, that they're there and they're fit, on top
yeah.
of acquisitions that we're hoping to get in the summer, what do you feel is a successful season?
I think you've got to look to get them back into the Champions League. I think that's absolutely imperative now. Another cup final would be nice, but I think that, to return United to that status of being a Champions League club and build on that so that they're consistently back in that competition, that's where they've got to be. I'd love to say they'd be ready for the league, but I think that will hinge on having a very, very good transfer window, which, given the stories we're hearing about the transfer funds and um, all the various constraints that are going to be coming United's and every other club's way, I think that's going to be quite difficult. I think we're talking at least another season before that's a possibility. But I think Champions League football's got to be the target. And I think most United fans, most level-headed ones, would probably take that. It's not going to be easy by any means, because you look at the progress that other clubs have made. Aston Villa being the obvious example this year. You'd expect next year Newcastle to be stronger. Even Chelsea, with all the circus that seems to be going on there, you'd expect to have a better season. So it wouldn't be that difficult. But I think if you can keep the players fit, and you mentioned Martinez just there, I think Martinez, more than anyone, I think, was missed last year. I think we saw it towards the end of the season when he did come back, especially in the cup final, obviously. And there was that game in West Ham, I think it was February. I was at that game, and he played in that, and he obviously got another injury in it. But United were great that day, and so much of it came from the fact Martinez had that composure on the ball and could play those passes through the lines. And United badly missed that for so much of the season. And I think you get those players back. I definitely think it's within the realms of possibilities that they do that, especially if they can add 1 or 2 smart signings to the team this year.
And when you're talking about the smart signings, I think it's quite clear that we have a midfield that can now be built around Kobbie Mainoo. He has just burst onto the scene. And every time I speak about him, I have to pull myself back because I start getting carried away with just waxing lyrical about how good he is. I genuinely believe that while there is several key areas that need to be targeted in the transfer window, if you can pair Kobbie Mainoo with a real quality partner in the center of the midfield, you're looking
Mm.
at a decade plus of a midfield coherence that can build and really lead United forward. Would you go along with that while looking at what you can see on the field where we do need to address?
I think, yeah, that probably slightly behind centre half. I know it might seem a bit strange, but I think given the nature of the injuries they had at centre back last year, obviously Varane's left now as well. I think they probably do need someone there as well, just to kind of help out. I mean, I've just been talking about Martinez and how important he is there, but were he to have another big setback again, I think United would really feel that. But I also feel they need someone else in there anyway. I wouldn't be surprised if they went for, I mean, there's obviously a lot of talk of Jared Branthwaite at the minute, but him and maybe another as well, if the budget allows for that. But I think, yeah, central midfield, definitely. I think we saw Amrabat in the cup final, by the way, was fantastic. I thought, from what I'd seen of him prior to that, I wasn't too sure at all. But I thought even him, just as someone who could come in and just actually be a specific defensive midfielder, which United don't really seem to have at the minute, that'd be useful. I'd ideally like someone a bit more established, maybe a bit younger too, if that's possible. But yeah, I think the big thing for me this year as well is height. I think we talk about Martinez, and he's not a big commanding centre half as good as he's on the ball. I think United do have quite a small side compared to a lot of the top teams in the league now as well. So I think worthy to get somebody in that midfield area. I'd like to see them get someone quite big. I've seen him linked with a lad from Benfica as well. Is it João Neves? I can't keep up with the names, but he seems a very good little player, but he doesn't seem particularly big as well. And a lot of people are talking about pairing him with Mainoo. I wouldn't be surprised if they went for somebody of the kind of stature of the lad at Everton, the other Anana. someone who's got a bit of height who can actually just win the ball back as well. I think he's a decent player technically as well, but obviously he brings a lot to the team physically, which I don't think we've really had in midfield for quite some time now. So, yeah, and I think probably after that, you'd probably have to say another striker because Højlund is as good as, I think he did a decent enough job last year, given he was dealing with his own injuries. The fact he was the only real out-and-out striker United had last year was pretty laughable, really, that he had to kind of do that himself for the full season. So who did bring in there, I'm not entirely sure, because, again, I quite like the idea of United going for younger players now. I think that's quite good. They've not really done that consistently for a while, and it's quite good to see them looking at that. But we're in a bit of an awkward position now with Højlund in that he's young still. Do you want to bring in a more experienced striker who's going to keep him out a bit more? Or do you bring in another younger striker to play alongside him and just alternate in that way? But I'd say, yeah, in list of priorities, I'd say centre-half first of all, then midfield, then a striker after that. But, we'll see how it pans out with the various constraints because, you never quite know what's going to happen at the minute, do you?
No, you don't. And when I'm looking at these transfer targets and I'm saying about priorities, centre half is a given the fact that Varane is gone. You have speculation Fenerbahce are open to taking Victor Lindelof as well.
He's such a Turkish league player, isn't he? You just expect that link to come up, don't you? You
Yeah,
know he's going to go
absolutely.
with some Galatasaray, Besiktas, or Fenerbahce. You just know it's coming.
And what I wanted to ask you about it as well, as an England fan and what we've spoken about, Jared Brantwaite obviously missed out on the final inclusion, and he's had what will be his breakthrough season in the Premier League. He's set a lot of plaudits around the place, and he's got a lot of people patting his back and saying that he is the next big thing. Everton apparently holding out for around £70 million. Now, this is a young guy who, even though he's got a season of Premier League football behind him, a lot of people are slightly worried given the mistakes that the club have made in terms of moving into that market previously. How highly do you rate Brantwaite from what you have seen? Do you think this is a player that United should be putting all their eggs in their basket for?
From what I've seen of him, he looks a very good player. In terms of value of players now and whether they should be paying 70 million or not, it's really impossible to say, isn't it? I think the way values are calculated these days, it's entirely up to Everton. I think that obviously 70 million has been the fee that's been bandied about. I completely get it from a perspective that he's two-footed. I think he prefers his left, doesn't he? He's young, he's English. You're going to pay a lot for him. I've got to be honest. Like I've only seen him play 2 or 3 times properly. One of the games I think was against City at the Etihad last year, and he was great that game. I think he may have been slightly at fault for one of the goals. I'm not entirely sure, but he had a really good game. And he's 21, isn't he? So he's obviously got a lot of improving to do. I think you're always going to pay a bit extra when it's an English player, especially a young one. But I don't think United can really afford to stretch to 70 million anyway, so I don't think it'll come to that. But I think what's just as pleasing for me, there's a couple of things with Brantwaite that I'm quite happy about. One is that you've got, a top English player and United appear to be front of the line, in front of the queue for him, which it feels like that's not really happened for about 10 years or so. It feels like United have always been a bit slow to react to these young players. So the fact that they might be front of the queue is quite promising. But secondly, it's this feeling now within Ineos that there are other options. They don't have to make this get dragged on for the whole 3-4 months ahead. They can actually look at other people as well, and there's other options too. And I do genuinely feel like it won't be one of those situations where if Everton aren't going to, buckle and sell for a price similar to what United are paying for, they won't have someone else lined up as an alternative. It feels like that hasn't been the case for so many years now. It's always been, we want that player, we're not going to pay that, and then it gets to August and they do pay that. Do you know what I mean? It just seems good and encouraging that they're moving in that direction.
I couldn't agree more. And obviously, with what I touched upon in my opening line, Carrington's men facilities are to
Mm,
receive the ultimate makeover now with a focus on gym, medical rehabilitation, all for players and their existing and whoever should come in. For the biggest club in the world, alongside Real Madrid, I know we shouldn't really be in a situation where Henry Winter has to tell me about Leicester City's significantly better facilities in 2024.
yeah,
But this is extremely welcome news, Simon, isn't it?
massively. A lot of people on Twitter have been pointing to the Ronaldo comments and what you will and saying how he's done this because he was obviously very critical of the facilities in that famous interview with Piers Morgan. But I don't think it should really come as much of a surprise, really. You've only got to look at Old Trafford and what's happened to that in the last 15 years or so since the Glazers came in. the last major structural work that was done in Old Trafford was 2006, I think it was completed, when the quadrants at the end of each end of the North Stand were finished off. That was signed off on before the Glazers came in. So that's not something the Glazers rushed through themselves. They've shown absolutely no intention of upgrading that. As far as I can see it, they were quite happy for Old Trafford to stay as it was, so long as what we saw on TV looked great, which was the inside of the ground. If you go to Old Trafford regularly, you see it all around the ground. I know everyone's having a great laugh at the roof leaking and what you will, but just the general wear and tear of the stadium, you can see it's not an awful stadium as some people would have you believe, but it's tired, and it has needed that. So if that's the bit that people are seeing on the TV and they're not really investing in that, it's no surprise to learn that the training ground hasn't really been touched in that time as well. So I wasn't massively surprised, but yeah, it's encouraging that they've identified that. It's encouraging so much money's been spent on it. And it's just, again, you hear of all these stories about various players they've tried to sign. And, Jude Bellingham, we've already mentioned with his performance for England this week. Jude Bellingham came to that training ground a few years ago when they were trying to sign him. And from what I can gather, he and his dad weren't all that impressed by what they saw. And I've spoken to a few people who knew Jude Bellingham in last job, and they talked to me directly about this. And they said the feeling was that he went to look at Dortmund, and everything from the culture of the club, from the facilities that were there, were better than what they had at Manchester United. That's laughable when you look at the amount of money United turn over compared to a club like Dortmund, who, although they're consistent in the Bundesliga and they're always somewhere near the top and they've just got to a Champions League final, United's income compared to that it's a different stratosphere, isn't it? So it's encouraging. And again, you think about prospective signings and that focus on bringing in younger players. You would hope that would have an impact for people that are getting shown around in the future and people that, want to be coming to Old Trafford and realising that it is a place that's back on the up, and it is a place where you just said there that one of the biggest clubs in the world plays at,
I'm glad you said Jude Bellingham and that meeting, because we are aligned in our thought process. That's exactly what I thought around the time when I read it first. Remaining on football now, but focusing on you. I want to speak to you
This sounds
about
quite scary, this, mate. Something got very personal.
I want to speak about your beautiful book, United with Dad. For those who are unaware, a tale that embodies everything from laughter to tears and everything in between. At a time when you were at your lowest, can I ask you to describe the correlation between your love for your father and the historic football club that ultimately culminated in that book?
Yeah, so the background to this is, without giving too much away about the book, my dad passed away 4.5 years ago now. Towards the end of his life, he died. He had prostate cancer and he also had dementia too. And it was at United. I'd had a season ticket with my dad for years. I used to go to all the games with him. And as I write in the book, a lot of the relationship that I had with him was based on United and the memories that we had. I talk about a lot in the book about me as a young lad and going to games with him, and that awkward spell you get to in your teenage years where you kind of want to rebel against your parents a bit and you want to be a bit different and make yourself, into your own person. And I feel like through that time, the thing that really sustained our relationship was United and going to the game together. And I think the book tries to encapsulate that relationship as well and talk about what it is for many father sons and just any people that go to the game with somebody that they love, really, and what it means for them. But as you got older, you kind of become more aware of that, especially when you see a parent who once took you in when you were a little lad getting older and not being able to take the stairs up to the top of the stand and what you will. And it was at going to United I started to realise something was slightly wrong with the dementia. I talk in one of the early chapters about how I was at a game close to Christmas against Bournemouth, and it was the winter after Rooney had gone in the summer transfer. He'd gone back to Everton, and my dad suddenly turned to me in the first half. He goes, "Where's Rooney tonight?" I'm like, "What are you on about?" And you try and push it away and think there's nothing really going on. It's can't be anything too serious. And then the second half, he asked me exactly the same question, and I kind of was like, "Oh shit, there's something wrong here." And it was kind of like that love of United and that relationship that he had with the club and the relationship we'd built together based on our memories going to the club was really important towards the end. again, I go into a lot of detail about this in the book, but when he was in the nursing home towards the end of his life, I'd go and speak to him, and there would be times where he wouldn't know who I was. He'd not have any idea who I was. I'd be a complete stranger to him. And there'd be this moment that would happen every time I went, and the kind of like the fog would lift a little bit, and he'd suddenly go, "Oh, how are United getting on?" And we'd have, sometimes for 5 minutes, sometimes for a bit longer, we'd have a semi-normal conversation about United, and that meant the world to me at the time. And I felt guilty in a way that when he recognised me, that's what we talked about. That was all we had. But also, I was really, really grateful for it as well. And it's a difficult place to be in, when you see your dad obviously getting very, very poorly and ultimately dying with it. But the book was kind of a way of me trying to process what had happened, but also to try and make sense of why, like, at such a bad time like that, you still clutch onto those memories and why football actually does mean so much to so many people.
It's a fantastic synopsis of what it is. It's heartbreaking, and
Mm.
it's beautiful, and it's cherishing all in one. And that's what makes the book so special. Something that I have not yet done on this podcast is dedicate any form of a segment to listeners' questions, because I simply haven't had the time to be able to do so when I'm speaking with individuals. But a valuable supporter of what I'm trying to do has prompted two very appropriate questions that I feel deserve to be put to you today, because ultimately they're along the lines of what I would have touched on anyway. The first that they ask: what was the biggest challenge that you faced when you were writing the book?
Um, I think it was simply getting it into the right structure, because I think I'd known for a long time, even before my dad was poorly, I always thought it was great that his life kind of like encompassed all the big things that have happened in Manchester United's history. I always wanted to write something about how, when he was a little lad, he used to go watching the Babes, how he was absolutely heartbroken when he was in his teens by Munich, and how when me and my brother were born, he got to kind of relive all the glory again with his two kids. I thought that was great. But I also wanted to kind of like process what I was feeling, the grief, and try and get that out there. So I guess it was settling on a structure that would allow me to do that. And I've got to be honest, like when I agreed to do the book and I'd spoken to the publisher, I set about writing it. I don't think you can fully prepare yourself when you write a book like that for the things that it opens up. What I found when I was doing it, there were things that I'd forgotten in the process. So many things that you kind of like, you put away in a drawer in your mind, and you just think, I can't relive that again. And it comes back to you again. So I guess it was just working through that again. It was definitely cathartic, but it was also quite difficult at times trying to go through all that again and talk about some of the more difficult moments I had with my dad's decline. And it was surreal, really, because I was doing it from a football perspective as well. And there were also those moments where you were talking about something very, very sad, but you're also talking about something that's quite humorous as well. So I guess it was that roller coaster of emotions and trying to process that while putting it into a coherent, structure that someone else who didn't know my dad and didn't know the story could then pick up and understand.
Very, very understandable. That'll tie me into the second part of what the listeners said. Of all the games that you attended together, is there one match that stands out for both the result and the joy that you experienced with your father at the time?
Uh, I think there'd be two, really, for different reasons. I think one of the games, I was thinking about this the other day, actually. I don't even know if I mentioned it in the book, but um, one of the games I would go for, and this might sound a bit strange given that this season ultimately United won nothing, but it meant a lot for what came after it. It was Juventus at home, 97-98. So they went out of the Champions League that year to Monaco. It was pretty disappointing because the year before that they got to the semis against Dortmund and had bowed out then. But to me, like in our house, when I was a kid, we didn't have Sky or anything. We don't mean to sound like Rishi Sunak here, but we sorry, my dad refused to watch football on Sky. He said, "I'm not paying for that." It was an outrage to me. He couldn't get his head around the fact people were now being made to pay for football. So we watched a lot of Italian football, the Channel 4 stuff, and uh, it was amazing, wasn't it? You could obviously see these stadiums, and you saw James Richardson obviously sitting in various piazzas with his cappuccino and that, and it was proper escapism. And Italian football at that time was the benchmark, wasn't it? It was the absolute standard. The best players in the world were there. It was fantastic. And Juventus were, to me, like the big team. And they'd already played United a couple of times. And to me, it never really felt like United, even though they only lost a couple of games by the odd goal, it never really felt they were at that level. It always felt that, United were great domestically. They'd be there or thereabouts in the title race every year. But the Champions League, it wasn't quite where they were yet. And that feeling kind of like, I think my dad felt the same too. He'd grown up obviously obsessing over the European Cup, and it didn't really feel like United were in a position where they could challenge for that. But that game, they beat them, I think it was 3-2 in the end of the group stage. And that night, I'll always remember because it was absolutely electric at Old Trafford that night. It was fantastic. And obviously beating them, I think, symbolised that United, even though it wasn't going to be for another season and a half, they were finally at a stage where they could go toe-to-toe with these teams. And on the day, they could beat them. And to me, that was amazing. I'll always remember that night for that reason. And I think, there's that. And I look at one of the more later games was the last one where they won the league, which also feels quite a long time ago now. But that game against Aston Villa, because that was, it was like, it obviously proved to be quite significant later on because my dad became poorly after it. But I remember being in the ground at full time, and it was 3-0. It'd been 3-0 against Villa since the first half, and Van Persie had scored his hat-trick, and the second half had just been one long wait for full time basically. And there was a few chants of like, champions towards the end, and it was all pretty much done, and they were just waiting for full time. And my dad just turned to me and he kind of like put his arm on my shoulder and he said something about, I cannot wait for when you have kids and we can come to nights like this. And it always stayed with me because obviously my children weren't born at this point. I was still too young. I was getting married the next year, and I would have absolutely desperately loved to have taken my kids to a game with him, and it never quite came to be that happened. But it's a moment that I'll always remember because the full-time whistle went pretty much straight after that, and he put his arms around me and all that, and that wasn't very much the sort of thing that my dad did. So that was special for different reasons too. One was very much football. Two was very much just that sense of being there with somebody you care about and witnessing nights like that. And I really hope that me and my own kids get that at some point soon, because we're at a point now where they're just taking an interest in it, and hopefully we'll get a few nights like that ourselves too.
That's absolutely fantastic, Simon. Thank you for bringing everybody through that. I mean, that's wonderful. I mean, the grief and the pain that you felt, I don't know how to comprehend that, but the fact that you speak about it so articulately and that you can share this
It
picture
feels
with
like I'm
everybody.
just waffling, to be honest, mate. So thanks for that.
Not at all. Not at all. You're not waffling in any way, shape, or form. Have you got any aspirations of moving on towards more literature, any more books, or anything else down the pipeline for you?
I've been asked about this quite a bit. A couple of people, various publishers have asked as well, which has been nice too. It's a sign that what I've done so far has been nice, been well received. But I think for now, I'm quite happy. I think you've got to have something to write about, and for me, there was obvious motivation to do the book that I did, and it was something that helped me a lot, and it was something that as well, my own kids now, they don't really remember my dad, so. Robin, my youngest, she wasn't even born then, but Ethan, who was 2.5 when he passed away, he's no memory of him anymore. So it's nice that they've got something they can pick up in a few years' time when they're old enough and learn something about Grandad Dave that they didn't, the granddad they didn't really get to know. But for now, I'm quite happy with what I'm doing. I'm back teaching, which has been something I did when I was a lot younger, and decided to come back into it a while ago for a bit of stability and getting my weekends back. So it's not always that I get my weekends free, but yeah, I'm enjoying that. And if the opportunity presents itself where something comes about and I quite like the sound of it, then yeah, I'll keep an open mind towards it.
Anyone that's listening that now will quite clearly want to read this book, where would you advise them to go and get it? Available everywhere?
Pretty much, yeah. Online seems to be the way to go with it. It's had some lovely reviews, like I said, and it's been really nice having so many people reach out about it and relay their own experiences, whether it's Manchester United related or not. I do try very hard in the book not to be too, anti-City and Liverpool, but naturally a little bit of that always slips out, as you'd expect. But no, it's been a lovely process to go through, to be honest. It's been very helpful and nice to see so many people take it the right way.
You deserve every bit of it. And that Liverpool City angst, that's just all authenticity. That adds to the absolute nature of the book, Simon. That's all that
Honestly, I
is.
was really good with it. I was really, really good. I had a mate of mine who's a big City fan. He's been all the way through the leagues with him and everything. Um, he actually read it and he said, "I can't believe how toned down it is, given what he knows about me as a person." So I guess that's
No, that,
a compliment.
of course, it's a compliment. That was fantastic, Simon. Thank you for taking us through that, sharing such wonderful memories. And for anyone listening that might want to get in touch with you to chat about the book or any similar experiences that they have encountered, what's the best way that they can do so?
Probably Twitter, or X as it's known these days. That's the best bet. I don't really spend too much time on social media these days, but that's where I'll be. So my handle is at SMNLLYD5. So yeah, that's the best place to catch me.
And it is well worth your while to do so, people. As always, that was a fantastic chat and an absolute pleasure to spend time with you. If you'd like to get in touch with me, you can do so on Twitter as well at Shaun Connolly 85, and be sure to follow theatre_of_red across every social channel. And finally, and most importantly, if you wouldn't mind subscribing and leaving a review wherever you're listening today, it'll help this man very, very well. Enjoy the football. We'll speak to you all next week.
Touching